Have you ever looked up at the rings of Saturn and wondered if our own Earth could have something similar? Well, today we are going to talk about that possibility and see what it would take for Earth to have rings like Saturn. If you've ever seen the planet Saturn through a telescope or even just a pair of binoculars, you've probably noticed its spectacular rings. They are intermediate in complexity, halfway between the more extensive set around Jupiter and Neptune, and the simpler rings found around Jupiter's moon Europa and Neptune's moon Proteus. So how did Saturn get such cool rings? Saturn formed 100 million years before the Earth formed, and in the early stages of its existence, it had a giant core of ice, rock and dust that was large enough to be considered a mini-planet. This core acted like a seed for the planet, providing a starting point for the accretion of gas and the formation of the planet's atmosphere. As Saturn grew in size, its gravitational pull became stronger and it began to sweep up more and more ice, rock and dust from the surrounding area. This material formed a thin disk around the planet and eventually condensed into rings. Now, there are a lot of theories out there about where the rings came from. One theory is that they formed naturally as a result of the planet's gravity. Another theory is that the rings were created by the debris left over from a shattered moon or comet. However, scientists have yet to reach a consensus on this issue. But one thing is certain, the rings are made up of ice and rock. The majority of Saturn's rings are opaque and only a few miles wide, which means that they reflect a lot of sunlight. This makes them visible from Earth even though they are incredibly thin. In fact, Saturn's rings are so thin that if you were to stretch them out, they would be only about 20 feet or 6 meters wide. As far as we know, Earth doesn't have any rings because it doesn't have a giant core of ice, rock and dust to start the process. However, that doesn't mean that it's impossible for Earth to have rings like Saturn. In fact, scientists believe that the Earth did have rings in the past. These rings were likely made of ice and rock, just like Saturn's rings, and they formed in a similar way. However, these rings didn't last very long. The Earth's atmosphere likely eroded them away over time. So if the Earth had kept its rings, they would have looked similar to those of Saturn. But it's also possible that the Earth could have rings made of something else. For example, the rings of Jupiter's moon Europa are made of ice, and the rings of Neptune's moon Proteus are made of dark material. If the Earth had rings made of something similar to Europa's, they would be much more difficult to see because they wouldn't reflect as much light. However, they might be easier to detect with other instruments, such as radar. And then there are the rings of Jupiter's moon Ganymede. These rings are intermediate in complexity, halfway between the more extensive set around Saturn and the simpler rings found around Europa and Proteus. If the Earth had rings like those of Ganymede, they would be fairly complex and could be made of ice, rock, or a combination of the two. In general, the more massive a planet is, the more rings it has. This is because the rings are formed from the debris that is close enough to the planet to be held in its gravitational pull. As a result, the largest planets in the solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, all have rings. The smaller planets, including Earth, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, do not have rings. However, some of the smaller planets have rings that are intermediate in complexity. For example, Jupiter's moon Europa has simple rings that are similar to those around Saturn's moon Dione, and Neptune's moon Proteus has simple rings that are similar to those around Saturn's moon Pandora. So it's possible that Earth could have rings like those of Saturn, but it would take a lot of work to get them there. We would need to either find a way to make Earth more massive or find a source of ice and rock that we could use to form the rings. But it is possible. With enough work, we could make it happen, and the view from Earth would be spectacular. We hope you enjoyed learning about the rings of Saturn and the possibility of Earth having rings like those of Saturn. If you did, please subscribe and leave a like. We'd love to have you back for more videos. Thanks for watching.